Well, welcome everyone to our Q&A session of the Research Forum. We're so glad that you are here today. And with us, we have Lynn Haynes and hopefully soon Jamal Matthews. For those of you who don't know Lynn, Lynn is the director of HRPP. Is it 3 Ps or 2 Ps?
2 Ps.
2 Ps.
It's the Office of Research.
I always get confused by that. And Jamal Matthews is our Chief Bioinformatics Officer. And so folks have submitted questions previously that they wanted to ask either me, Lynn, or Jamal. But please, if you have additional questions, please put them in the chat. Rochelle Riano will be watching the chat for those questions. So we will go ahead and get started here. Lynn,
it looks like Betsy, it looks like she's still adding. People are still sort of coming on because there were a lot of people in the wait room. So we might want to give it just another minute.
So maybe while we're waiting, just a minute. Oh yeah, it looks like she's adding. For those of you that don't know, I will give a couple updates while we're waiting. The first is that we are going to be celebrating not Clinical Trials Day, but Clinical Trials Month, the month of May. And so we have a couple really great research forums scheduled. We're working on scheduling some celebrations of our clinical research professionals so that we can thank you and celebrate the work that you've done over the past year. So look for information about that coming out in both our newsletter. We'll try and get it in the know, and it's on our LinkedIn as well. So just an update about that, and really, really interesting session. So I think you'll want to attend that. And further than that, I think we are just about ready to roll here.
Did we find Jamal yet?
She's having difficulty finding her link to get in.
Okay. So maybe we'll go ahead and get started with a question for Lynn, and then hopefully we can get Jamal on. All right. Okay. Great. So Lynn,
yeah, go ahead.
The first question is, how do I know if I need to submit a change of protocol?
Yeah, thank you. And this was actually a question when I queried the IRB staff for what are the most common things that we get when people contact us through the Ask the IRB or via the phone line. And this is one that comes up all the time. So we did really try to be very clear in our language in the investigator manual about post-approval responsibilities. And that page, and are we going to be doing any sharing of pages at all, or are we just talking? We're just chatting?
I think you can share the page.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
I can share the page. Okay. This is the page that has all of the information about when you would need a change, the requirements, how to decide if there's a change of PI, because those are a little bit different. So use this page first and then move on to contacting the IRB staff if the kind of change that you need is not clearly outlined here. Does that help?
That is great. Thank you for that. Okay. The next question is, and I think any one of us might be able to answer this. I certainly can help. Can you talk about the difference between an opt-out and a patient declining participation? I can start with that, and Lynn and Jamal can certainly jump in. So opt-out at our institution is used for opting out of generalized communications. So things like MyChart, phone reach outs, letters, if they're, you know, if there's some other kind of research, reach out. That is what our opt-out is for. That opt-out does not prevent patients from being approached by their provider or a care team about a clinical trial that might be important for them. So it's really about communication methods and not about the study itself. A decline is when you ask a patient, would you like to be part of this study? And they say no. That's a decline for the study. That doesn't mean that they have said no to other studies. It just means for that study, they have said no and you can't approach them again. So hopefully that makes it a little clearer. I don't know, Jamal or Lynn, if you have any other comments about that.
No, but I do know that there are ways that now in HealthLink we can monitor this. And so I think it's really important that if someone says no, that it is appropriately monitored. And with the new use of the my chart to be able to communicate about studies, there are also options there for individuals to say, I don't want to get these kind of messages anymore. And those are, again, messages that are coming through a particular path, like through HealthLink, and those will be honored for sending those kinds of messages. And as you suggested, if they opt out of that kind of messaging for broad potential consent or participation, you doesn't mean that that a study team or an investigator who has where the patient is has could specifically be in a study because of their health condition, that investigator can't talk to them about that. Anne had a question, or somebody had something in the chat.
Yeah, I think Anne put a link to the tools in the chat. So for those of you who want to look at the tools, Anne Wiebens added them in the chat. Jamal, a question for you is, we know that our systems are getting integrated. Can you talk a little bit about your overall vision for clinical trial systems? Oh, we can't hear you. You might be on.
So sorry, forget to unmute all the time. Like, that's a great question. So, you know, ideally, when we get to the nirvana for clinical trials, we would want to have an integration between our IRB system, our clinical trials management system, our electronic data capture system, which is REDCap, EPIC, and also the financial management system and the regulatory documentation system, which is our Florence. So we are not there yet. We are doing this in a methodical way. So the initial round of integrations we focused on between Encore, which is our CTMS, and EPIC. And now we are expanding it to Encore, EPIC, and REDCap, which is our EDC system. And eventually that would mean that, you know, obviously when a patient is on a trial, you'll see that in HealthLink, you will be able to eventually capture maybe adverse events in EPIC. We may be able to pull that into the electronic data capture system. We will be able to pull data from EPIC into the, you know, lab data, for example, could automatically fall into the REDCap system, etc. So, you know, our grand vision is to have these 5 systems integrated well, but we are not there yet.
Great, thank you, Jamal. Lynn, another question for you is, I can't find my study team member in the Arrow study team chooser. Why not?
Sorry, I muted myself and then I forgot. Generally, this falls into one of two categories. Either the individual has a net ID, but they are not yet in the Arrow system. There is help desk right by the chooser in the application to request for that individual to get access to the Arrow system. The other reason is when study teams are trying to do a change of protocol, we have this administrative process for adding individuals to protocols that doesn't require the full IRB review, but we have some checkpoints on that, one of which is that they have to have completed their training. And what often happens is, because of the activities that they will be doing in the study, they have been identified as someone who needs not just the normal city human subjects training, but perhaps the additional GCP training or VA training. And if either of those trainings are missed and are not completed and up to date, then that individual cannot be added to the protocol. So that's generally the two reasons why people can't find their folks in the chooser and can't add them.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. Jamal, another question for you. How might we use our systems to help us better identify potential research participants?
Okay. So I think like Betsy said and Lynn said, we are an opt-out institution, which allows us to reach out to participants who haven't explicitly opted out from any future communication about anything. And so leveraging that, we have all the information on the patients that we see at UW Health, Swedish American, and ACHC. So we could do recruitment from that population. So when you have a study, you can come to the CURTS team, put in a request. It has to be IRB approved, and your recruitment methodology has to be outlined in the IRB document. But at that point, you know, we'll have the current intake process is through the CURTS. I mean, in the next couple of months, we'll have a different intake process for recruitment assistance. So you will be able to put in the request, and we will be able to provide you a list of candidate patients. Now you have to keep in mind that it's never going to be a perfect list, because you know the electronic data, the data in the EHR systems is never perfect for a research recruitment. That's not the intention why that data gets there to begin with. But you know, you will be able to take that as a seed list, refine it further by maybe looking at chart reviews when needed, and then reach out to patients. And if MyChart is one of the mechanisms that you would be interested in leveraging, and that is outlined again in your IRB proposal and it's approved, then we will be able to assist you with reaching out through MyChart also.
Thanks, Jamal. Lynn, another one for you. Can you take a minute to explain SAE and AE reporting? For example, if an expected outcome of the protocol is death, do we still need to report it to the IRB, and how would we know?
Yeah, so I chatted with Catherine Rogers, who's the assistant director at the IRB, who oversees the MRR team and has been a key leader on our post-approval team to help with this question, because it can be confusing. But the focus is that for an SAE, an adverse event, to be reportable, it must meet or appear to meet the 3 criteria, which again, these can be found on our website in some of our documents, and maybe Anna could be so kind as to post where these are as well. But it's probably caused by or associated with study participation. That means it's more likely than not caused by study participation. It's unexpected in nature. And By that, we mean that the frequency or the severity is different than what was expected. Again, there are some studies where the study is working with patients who are terminal. And so we recognize that there are going to be deaths in those groups. Is that death probably related to the participation in the study and unexpected? And finally, is the adverse event, or in this case, the death, immediately life-threatening or severely debilitating to current participants and others not participating in the study? i.e., is it something that we need to know about because we might need to change the protocol to protect other patients in the study? And so those are the three things that you should go through before you to make a decision about whether it needs to be reported. And again, you can always communicate with the IRB to be certain, but those, and there is on the page that Anna has posted there, we also have some flow charts, which when you walk through the flow chart, it can help you make those decisions about whether or not reporting is needed. The VA has slightly different requirements for reporting on subject death. So we do have a toolkit worksheet that provides the information about VA studies.
Great, thanks, Lynn. And that flow sheet is really incredible. It's a great decision tool. So I would encourage people to go out and use it. I've used it several times myself, so I can vouch for it. Jamal, another question for you. Let's see. Colleagues raised questions about the completeness and accuracy of self-reported race and ethnicity data on UW Health patients. Can you please provide what the state of the data is and how it might be enhanced to inform research currently and in the short term?
Yeah, so we did look at race and ethnicity, and unfortunately, I don't have the exact percentages, but recently what we are seeing is there is much more accuracy. I wouldn't say accuracy, much more completeness for the race and ethnicity data. That was not the case probably in the earlier years, but as we have come to 2022, there's a lot more completeness. I don't have the exact percentages, I can get that. But our ongoing efforts are to make sure that, and this is a recognized factor because race and ethnicity is something that we report all the time for NIH also. So we try to get that data accurate, but the issue is it happens at registration, and we may not really have the complete information all the time. But given the reporting requirements that the hospitals have, things have improved tremendously.
Thanks, Jamal. And I think one of the things that I will also throw out is that race and ethnicity in some ways is a social construct. And so someone very close to Jamal has done some work on looking at sort of self-reported race and then actually genetic, like what we would say genetically about race. And so I think folks just want to use that self-reported with that perspective, in that this is people's social construct. This is them self-reporting their race, but it may be somewhat different than you would expect to see if we were to look genetically at people's race and ethnicity. So just a really interesting construct, and something we'll have to consider as we're trying to bring more diversity into clinical trials and research in general. Thanks so much, Jamal, for that answer. Let's see, there's one more question, and I'm not familiar with this platform, but maybe Jamal is. The electronic health record can be critical support for understanding and responding to social determinants of health. Can you explain how the Unite Us platform complements or connects to UWH Epic for EHR?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with the particular platform that you said, Unite Us, but I'll tell you two things that we are currently working on. One of the things that I'm very interested in is to capture some information universally from all patients. One of them is social determinants of health. The second is, a general health quality check. So we are trying to leverage some of the PROMIS measures, if you're familiar with that, because it's a standardized form. So we are working on it. And once those PROMIS measures that Epic has is purchased and then implemented, we'll be able to do that. But we are seriously looking into social determinants and the general health status to be added.
Thanks, Jomal. Another one for you, Lynn. What are the most common compliance concerns that you see around clinical research?
Yeah, and this is these apply to both clinical and I think non-clinical research, but human subjects research. The two most prominent areas of concern that we see are appropriate screening and enrollment. So documenting eligibility criteria so that you don't inadvertently enroll a participant who is not, who doesn't meet the eligibility criteria. And ensuring that is done appropriately. Consenting issues. This is a huge issue. And generally these can range from really small to really big. The really small are you used, in the olden days, we used to stamp the consent forms with both the approval date and the expiration date. And so sometimes study teams would use one that was expired, even though it was the same one that was the new one. So we got rid of the expiration dates. But we still have sometimes study teams pulling the incorrect old consent form that had been updated and using incorrect consent forms. We also have issues with a lot of study teams, unfortunately, making copies of the consent form that is the correct consent form, but not the stamped version of the consent form. So we don't have validation that it was a consent form that was IRB approved. And sometimes we don't have appropriate signatures when needed. Unapproved changes. This, again, happens fairly frequently, where more frequently than it should. Study teams, those who are the coordinators and doing the research, get separated a little bit from what's exactly in the protocol. So someone suggests a change and they make a change, and that change was not reported to the IRB, and it was a change that should have been reported to the IRB. And so that is then a compliance concern. And finally, the other one is a failure to conduct, to order or conduct safety lab. So again, this would be not doing something that is in the protocol. It's not doing something that's different than was in the protocol. You're doing a procedure that wasn't there, but rather you're omitting something that was in the protocol that was in there for a good reason, which was it was a safety measure to ensure that the patients are being protected. So those are the ones when we do our monitoring and when we get reportable events that are up there.
Great, thank you. So I know that Jamal only has a few more minutes with us. So I'm not seeing any other specific questions for her. If you have another question for Jamal, please put it in the chat. She's going to have to leave in about 5 minutes. So another question is a pretty loaded one, is what will research look like at East Park? So I'm not sure I can explain all of that, but let me start by showing you what East Park research space will look like. Maybe that's a good start. So you see here, and I believe this is second floor. It's very hard to see here which floor this is. Well, anyway, East Park is going to be a fully integrated clinical trials operation. And so what's really nice about this is that our clinical research space, exam rooms, touchdown space, etc., are right there with our clinical partners. So patients will flow through the workflows as they would flow through any other clinical area. So they'll check in, they'll be brought to the room, they may be going to a clinical room, they may be going to a research room, but it's going to be very patient-centric. So what you see here is the first floor, which has this purple area. In here is the lab. Let me make this bigger. I'm sure this is so tiny for everybody. Let's see if that will help. Okay. And the area, so this purple area is all of the lab. And then you see this separate square to the left, and that has 3 benches in it. That is the research lab. So this lab isn't primarily for like processing samples that we're going to be sending out. This is more for samples that will be processed, tissue, blood, specimens, and then go to research labs at the hospital. So that is the first floor, and that's our footprint there. On the second floor, and let me move this just a little bit so you can hopefully see where we are. Okay, so on this one, that is not working. On this one, this is the second floor tower, and you can see all of these spaces on the outside, all around here, are touchdown spaces. Those are not assigned to anyone, all along the windows here too on the top, and can be used by any of our research staff, PIs, anyone who is working over at East Park and needs a space to touch down. So that is in the second floor tower. Additionally, when you come over by this blue section, which is integrated medicine, there are 3 research rooms right next to that. So 2 right adjacent and 1 across. And those can be used by research teams for things like blood draws, for complex consenting, for questionnaires or interviews, or just pure research visits. And then lastly is the second floor oncology. So if you look here, you will see there are a large number of infusion rooms, exam rooms, etc. And then to the far right, you will see a row of purple rooms around the far right wall, and then 6 additional rooms. This is the clinical trials unit at East Park. The orange is our little processing lab, so we'll have a processing lab. We will have nurses embedded here, and there also will be scheduling of these rooms that can be done by research teams. The proximity to the infusion center for oncology is purposeful because some days we have more clinical patients and some days we have more research patients. And this allows our nurses in this clinical trials area, as well as the nurses within the infusion center, to work together to care for these patients to make sure that they're covered no matter where they are. So we're working on the staffing, which obviously is going to be very complex. We need to look at volumes both at the hospital and at East Park and do some predictions, but wanted to make sure that you could all at least see the space. And we'll most certainly have upcoming research forums about East Park and the different areas. So we'll probably have one about lab and how that's going to work, how the clinical trials unit will work. And so look for those probably at the end of the summer, fall, and the winter for next year. All right. Are there any other questions about East Park? That's not a lot, but we don't have a lot figured out yet. So we're still working on that.
When is
Okay.
it supposed to be up and running?
Yeah, so it's supposed to be fully open to patients sometime late next fall. So fall 2024. We expect though that it will be open sometime in late summer 2024, and we can start doing workflows. So we may have, standard patients or, volunteers that come in and act as a patient, and we try and get them through the workflows as best we can, because this is a new model of the way we're going to interact with our research patients. We're really excited about it, but there's things like scheduling rooms that people haven't had to do before. And how do we get pharmaceuticals from the main hospital out to East Park and things like that. So there's a lot of logistics we need to figure out, but we're really excited to have this expanded space. And I think patients are really excited to not have to drive to the hospital if they don't absolutely have to. So, and it does have lots of great parking, and I think it's going to be a great center to do research.
How much of the clinical research do you expect to move from the main hospital from CSC out to?
So we don't know for sure yet. We do know that approximately 70 to 80% of oncology will be moving out to East Park, which is a lot of our research. So that's a huge proportion that will be moving out there. And I think there are some other specialties that will be doing research out there, GI, allergy and pulmonary, maybe doing some research out there. So it's really available to anyone who might have research that could be done in an outpatient setting. The hours will be expanded. So it will be 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And it will be open, I believe, from 9 to 1 on Saturdays as well. So extended hours, extended footprint, and really doubles our clinical research space, which is incredible. So we're really looking forward to it, and we'll continue to update everybody as we get more and more information about how that's going to unfold. Let's see if there are any other questions here. Oh, Lynn, here's a question for you. What's the reason that we don't allow for broad consent at UW?
Yeah,
that's a loaded one.
Yeah, it is. And it's one that comes up at every, you go to professional meetings in the IRB, HRPP realm, and this is something that is talked about a lot. And it's interesting, when the hands go up and there's a poll, how many institutions have implemented broad consent? There's like one hand that goes up. So, and the primary reason for this is that when broad consent is used, it has to be, we have to understand who has opted out, because when you opt out, when you say, I'm not going to participate in this broad consent, your data cannot be used for any studies that might be conducted under a waiver of consent. And that's part of the rules. So this was something, and I'm actually going to read this because Lisa Wilson helped us put this together. So something she presented at a SACCARP meeting. Extensive and seamless IT system capacity will be necessary for any institution or health system to implement fully broad consent tracking system, because both the consent and the refusal to consent, unless the materials are destroyed, must be tracked over the lifetime of the person who gives the broad consent and the persons who refuse to give such consent. So I'm actually, hopeful that with the new data systems that we have and the new management that we have, which is far superior to what we had in the past, we might at some point be able to get to a place where we could provide broad consent. But at this point, we nor any other, most other large academic medical centers do not have the systems in place to be able to provide that sort of level of assurance to a participant who either opted in or opted out. So that's why we have not implemented it here at the UW.
Yeah, Lynn, I just have one thing to add to it. Like, so the challenge, like Lynn said, is the moment you put a universal consent, in many ways, you lose the ability to operate on the, waiver of consent, because you have said that you could possibly consent all the people. So the issue is that I had the luxury of being in an institution that attempted to implement universal consent. What ends up happening is, and in that particular case, it was a target institution for a disease, and pretty much a lot of people would go there for care. But even in that setting, with an army of people trying to consent people, the consent rates hovered in the initial years around 70%, and then it started going down. So what you have all of a sudden introduced is, you said that you would do universal consent. You're not able to consent everybody, and you lost your ability to do waiver of consent studies. So that's the issue. So unless we have the systems, the operational capability, and a lot more education to our patients to be participating in research in the broad sense, it will actually work against us. So people have the tendency to think that universal consent will solve all the problems. Yes, it will, but in order for us to do it, it takes a village, and even then, you would probably anticipate around, in the best case, 70% consent rates.
And there's not, we do a lot of studies, we approve a lot of studies where the study team has said, we're going to store this data, samples, et cetera, and we're going to use it in these ways, and how we're going to either inform or not inform the subject. And in the case where they're not informing the subject in the future, they have that in the original consent. We may use your samples for either this specific type of research or, a variety of kinds of research that are listed. And then the individual has the option to say, yes, I want to have my samples banked, or I don't. And then there is the ability to be able to use those samples. And that model seems to work reasonably well for allowing for sharing and allowing for ongoing and continual research with sometimes some really precious samples, without having to have this universal consent where we then exclude a bunch of people who don't choose to be part of a broad consent process. So, and the follow-on, broad consent, I think, was used because there are like a couple of carve-outs for, well, these kinds of studies could be approved under an exemption if a broad consent was used, but the actual approval process isn't that much more complicated just to be able to get the approval to be able to do the research. So it's not a huge savings to go that sort of exemption route for a carve out, given all the other challenges with trying to implement broad consent.
Great, thank you so much. A message came in through the chat. I think for you, Lynn. Why does the IRB approval letter for a study not contain or list all the documents that were submitted for approval and approved? For example, advertisements, flyers, etc.
Well, those are in the IRB application. They're in the documents tab, and we don't stamp those because they're not consent forms. So they're not stamped, but they are available and they are there. I guess I'm not fully understanding the question. So maybe if somebody could do a follow on about.
Yeah, can you write what your concern is maybe, and we'll address
Lynn,
that.
Lynn, I think they're asking about the really short approval letters. Why aren't the approved documents listed in the IRB approval letters?
That's a good question. Would it be helpful to have the approved documents at least? So you're talking about just the name of a document in the approval letter? Because we do now have the funding listed in the approval letters. Are you talking about a list of all of the currently approved documents being listed there?
Yeah,
I
have
think
an
that's
answer.
what they're talking. Go ahead, Anna.
Could I, sorry to jump
Yeah.
into your section. I think part of the answer is that it's listed in the change description. So part of what we're approving is described in detail in the change description. So if you want to see what the approval covers, that's a very clear place to go look.
Would be quite helpful to list all the approved documents. Okay, that's interesting. We can have an internal conversation about that, about, you know, what would be the pros and cons of that? Because I think technologically we could easily do it. The question is, what are the pros and cons? And so let me double check with the internal folks about that.
I think sometimes in particular industry sponsors like to see that in the approval letter. And so that might be where the question is coming from, so that we don't have to submit multiple documents. And so if we could have that, or another person said, MJ said, if we're on a multi-site trial, they might need to see that all those documents were approved. So that might be one reason, but it sounds like more conversations needed about that.
So MJ, could you send me a copy of the approval letter that you are comparing ours against, that, because that might be helpful as a reference.
Yeah, we'll try and get, I'll follow up.
Thanks,
And,
MJ.
oh, there, MJ says we'll do. Great, thank you. So I think we have one last question here. Research teams are incentivized to partner and even co-design clinical research studies. Our human subject protections, compliance, and business offices seem to inconsistently recognize external, so non-UW employed stakeholders who may be interested in engaging in research, but not only as research subjects or as a service vendor. Do we have any thoughts to share about institutional readiness to support community engaged research and the role our offices play? That's an interesting question. So why don't we start with Jamal?
Yeah, so I think that's a very interesting thought, and we want to move and more and more become community engaged, for sure. And one of the examples is the program that I am the PI of, called SHOW, the Survey of Health of Wisconsin. So there's a lot of community engagement activities that we do through that to help researchers. So a very favorite topic for me, but we will have to look, and I'll be happy to have discussions with Betsy, me, and Lynn to see how we can help that. But definitely an area of interest.
Yeah, I think I'll partner on what Jamal has said. I think we are definitely coming of age in our organization to a point where we realize that our connections with our community, both in the direct area but statewide, are really, really critical. And we need to figure out how to better engage particular communities, populations, providers, to make sure that our research is not only meeting the needs of our institution, but also the needs of our community, because ultimately, clinical trials in particular are meant to move medicine forward and bring new innovative treatments and technologies to the general population. And so our engagement with community partners is really important, so that we do that in a smart way. Nobody is more frustrated than me when we open a study that is not appealing to anyone in the community and nobody wants to enroll in the study. So I think, those partnerships are something we want to work on and we want to think about. And we invite others. We're working on pulling together some programs that actually will help us do this better. But I think I would add to that, community partners are also important in the biotech community and what's being developed in the Madison marketplace as well. And so I think there's probably a multi-pronged approach here that needs to be implemented. And it's going to take a lot of folks to make that happen. But I agree, it's absolutely critical if we're going to be successful going forward. Lynn, do you have some thoughts as well? Oh, I'm sorry, Jamal. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just going to say, like, I'm thinking about an infrastructural grant, in the near future, and this could be a nice component. So if whoever who asked the question, if you don't mind reaching out, what the specific use cases you have in mind are, that would be very helpful.
We'll definitely get you connected, Jamal.
Okay, thank you.
Lynn, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, we agree completely. Sort of the community engagement. We're doing a lot of internal within the IRB, HRPP, trying to get ourselves, to recognize this entire sphere, because there's a lot that goes on. Unfortunately, by the time things come to the IRB, there's not much other than saying, you need to, you should be thinking about engaging more or broadening your inclusion, exclusion to include more different populations, or providing some training. It's a little too late. So we are working with the other groups on campus who are working with study teams as the studies are being developed. We did add 2 new city training modules about community engaged research, because I think getting that information to study teams and to PIs about what does it actually mean to do community engaged research? What are the important touch points, which is working with the communities to identify both the research questions as well as the research approach, and the, working with them on areas like, okay, we're thinking about approaching subjects this way. Well, that may not work with this population, or we're thinking about a compensation that is this kind of compensation. Well, that may not also be accessible to some populations of people. So there's a lot of education of our sort of the investigators on campus in this area. So I think this is a growing area, and I hope we definitely will be involved as part of the HRPP, because it's important.
Great, thank you so much, and great question. So those are the questions that we had submitted, and I'm not seeing any others in the chat. No, so I want to thank Jamal and Lynn for their time today. This was a great discussion and some really important topics. This is something we're going to plan to do periodically, because I know questions come up as you're doing your work. And so we again appreciate our panelists for being available and letting us bombard them with questions. And thanks to all of you for attending, and we will talk with you soon. Take care and have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.